found that prayer that Valerie prayed about being open to where God is leading and to telling God that I'm willing to follow is something that I've had to do that like continuously and never sort of get to the point where it's done. And in fact, one of the areas that happened was I thought I had kind of had it figured out for a long time, that what God really wanted was for me to behave in certain moral ways and then to worship God in certain ways, to be present on Sundays and give of my tithes and offerings and study the scripture and pray and these kinds of things. And then somewhere later on, I got introduced to the prophets of the Old Testament, and particularly, although he wasn't the only one, but Amos was one of the ones that jumped out at me. And I found this passage in there where God tells Amos to go and tell God's people, I am sick of your worship. And it goes on to say that the reason is that God says, if you don't have justice in your society, I don't care about the worship. I'd rather have justice in the society than really heartfelt worship without it. And it opened up this whole reality to me that God was interested not just what happened in my personal life, but what happened in the society around us. And I share that because it's kind of difficult because I don't have nearly as much control around the society around me as I'd like to think I do around myself, and yet to God, what happens in our society, and if it is a just and fair society, is important. I share that because today we start a new 3-week series of sermons called Bridging the Gap, Faith and Social Justice. We're going to look at some of the topics that have been in the news that are important in our nation, some of the issues that are around social things, and we're going to try to bridge some gaps. We want to bridge the most important gap between faith and our society and how our faith might inform our interaction with issues in our society. We want to try to bridge some gaps of experiences. Over the next couple weeks, Julie and I are going to be sharing some stories that may open up to see something in our society, for you to see those through a different set of eyes and a different perspective. And then finally, we want to bridge some gaps of knowledge. Lots of times issues are talked about rather vocally and passionately in our society, and yet either the people speaking don't necessarily have a whole lot of knowledge. They've got a little bit and they get real passionate about it, or maybe they do, but I as a listener don't have much of a depth of knowledge. In fact, as we come to our first topic today, which is immigration, I'm going to spend about half of my time doing just some education. I have been totally geeking out this week. I have been reading economics studies and demographic studies, and one, the National Academy of Sciences produced a report that came out last September called The Economic and Fiscal Consequences of Immigration. It's like 509 pages of like really nerdy data analysis and this kind of stuff. And I've been reading summaries of that, and so I've pared it down to just a few things that I want to share with you today, because these relate to things we hear about in the news, but when we may not have the full story. And so I'm going to start there and then go to the scriptures. So I'm going to look at immigration and economics and immigration and crime. But we'll start with the economics because this is where this big report was that I've been reading about. One of the things that you hear about in relationship to immigration is its effect on employment. And so, I should say about this study that came out, once it came out, people on the political left and people on the political right immediately pointed to it and said, yes, that's exactly what we've been saying all along. And the reason they were able to do that was because it's kind of complicated, and you'll see that as we go through. But I felt the fact that both sides claimed this report gave me a little bit of confidence. It wasn't entirely partisan. But here's what the study found when they looked at employment. One of the findings was that immigrants compete for jobs of people who have low education, like not a high school diploma, and people of very high education, like PhDs. Most of the immigrants who come into our country are looking for jobs that do not require much education. So that's the primary place where immigrants are competing for jobs, is in those lower education ones, but also some at the high PhD level. What they found, though, is that immigration also creates jobs. Because as new people come in and they get jobs, they spend money, and they rent apartments, and they buy food, and they buy clothing. One commentator on the report said, and there's a whole domino effect, because immigrants will need doctors, and doctors will need pharmacists, and pharmacists will need pharmacies, and pharmacies will need construction workers to build them. And so there's this whole kind of domino effect. And so the report wanted to look at, okay, so they're competing for jobs, meaning potentially taking jobs from native-born Americans, but also creating jobs. Does it balance? Is one more than the other? How does it pan out in the end? And what the study found was that overall, immigration does not have much effect on employment rate. Takes some jobs, but also creates some new ones, and it tends to about balance. Now that's jobs. The other side of this is wages. What does it do to what people get paid? And what the study found was that immigration tends to lower wages for those jobs that are low education jobs, anywhere from 0 to 9%, some of the studies estimated. So if you're on the lower end of income, immigration, there's a good chance that that's going to lower your wage. Now, there's another piece. If you're kind of middle income, which many of us are, you may have noticed that even as the national economy really has kind of grown and become more productive over the last couple decades, your buying power has probably not increased much. And what they call that is wage stagnation. Even if your salary goes up, your buying power hasn't increased much for many in the middle class. And so the question is, well, why not? If there's more money coming into the U.S., if our economy is kind of growing over those last couple decades, where's it going? Is it going to the immigrants? And what the study found was no. In fact, it's not going, wage stagnation of the middle class is not due to immigration. All that new money is mostly going to the people who were already in the upper income bracket. So if you've heard the thing of the rich are getting richer, that's what happened as our gross domestic product is growing. The wealthiest in the American and the U.S. over the last 20 years have gotten much wealthier. The middle class have stayed about the same, and the lower people with lower income jobs, their wages have actually decreased, part of which is due to immigration. Okay, the final thing on economics was, what about immigration's cost to the government? All of us pay taxes into the government. We receive services back. How does immigration affect that? And the big question was, do immigrants pay in as much as they get back? And so the study found that the first generation of immigrants tend to receive more than they give. So they'll get government benefits, public education, Medicaid, food assistance, subsidized housing, eligible for all these types of government benefits, and tend to get more value out of those than what they put in taxes. And if you look at immigrants who are illegal, most of the time they're not paying income tax, and so the gap is even wider. Okay, but here's where that gets a little complicated. This is for first generation immigrants. When you get to the second and third generation, those generations actually put more into the economy in taxes than they get out in government benefits on average. So again, a little complicated. The report gets to the end, and the National Academy of Sciences, they wrote this conclusion talking about these things I've mentioned, as well as some other factors. I just want to read to you what they came out with. They said that immigration is integral to the nation's economic growth. The inflow of labor supply has helped the United States avoid the problems facing other economies that have stagnated as a result of unfavorable demographics, particularly the effects of an aging workforce and reduced consumption by older residents. In addition, the infusion of human capital by highly skilled immigrants has boosted the nation's capacity for innovation, entrepreneurship, and technological change. So on the balance, what they concluded was that overall it was a net positive effect to the economy, the immigration was. Okay, so that's economics. Let me switch to crime, and then we'll get to the scripture. First thing I want you to know that I discovered when it comes to immigration and crime is that if you hear people citing like data and statistics on immigration and crime in the U.S. and they seem really authoritative, they're probably pulling your leg. Because what I discovered is that in the U.S., for the largest data sets of crime reporting, we don't collect data on immigration status. So if anybody is talking about data, they're talking about limited studies or something that happened in one small part of the country, but we don't have the kind of national data like we do for economics. As a point of reference, one of the articles I was reading talked about a study in the UK that they did where they do collect immigration status and crime statistics. What they found in the UK was that there wasn't any change in violent or property crime if immigrants had the right to work. And there were some different historical circumstances that allowed them to tease that apart, but immigrants without the right to work did cause a slight increase in property crime, but if they came into the UK, had the ability to work, they didn't see any statistical bump in violent or property crime. So there's not a whole lot we can really say about those types of crime in the US. One of the other things that comes up related to crime and talking about immigration is terrorism. And specifically people dying from, and because we're talking about immigration, I'll focus on foreign-born terrorists. And what I know is that when someone is killed in a terrorist incident, if it's an American that's killed, whether it's here in the US or abroad, it's reported in a lot of different places and with a lot of fervency. And I understand that because frequently these are horrific kind of things that happen. And so one of the questions I wanted to ask was if the fervency of which terrorist attacks and killings are reported, how that compares with the actual frequency of those attacks, or more specifically, for the kind of like volume, like loudness-wise in our society that we hear about deaths at the hands of foreign-born terrorists, how does that compare with the volume number-wise of people that actually die, to see if they're similar, if they're different, what that was. And so one of the ways that I did that was Business Insider. They did a little study with the National Safety Council to look at the lifetime risk that if I'm a U.S. citizen that I would die at the hands of a foreign-born terrorist, and look at the lifetime odds of that, and studying how many people had died from 1975 to 2015. They looked at all the people who had died at foreign-born terrorists' hands and used that to calculate your odds of dying at the hands of a foreign-born terrorist attack. And it comes out to your lifetime odds are about 1 in 46,000. So your lifetime odds of dying are 1 in 1, right? So put that in comparison. So how you die, the odds of dying at the hands of a foreign-born terrorist, whether you happen to be in the U.S. or somewhere else, those are about 1 in 46,000. So what does that mean? How does that compare to other things? Your odds of dying from heart disease or cancer are about 1 in 7. So you're about 6,500 times more likely to die from heart disease or cancer, about 1,500 times more likely to die from stroke, about 650 times more likely to die from flu or pneumonia, about 400 times more likely to die from a motor vehicle accident or falling. Or where this really started to make me think was when I got down to all of the different ways you could die, and I came down to this item on the list that said walking. Separate from falling, walking, your odds of dying from walking are 1 in 672 over your lifetime. That is 68 times more likely than dying at the hands of a foreign-born terrorist. I did just a little bit of research. I was like, how does this even happen? So think cell phones. So the biggest majority of people who died from walking, they specifically called it distracted walking, walking out into traffic, or in your home, walking into what the report called, quote, immovable objects, and then suffering after that a fall or a concussion or something that resulted in death. I don't know what that means for public policy and these kinds of things, but because the terrorism deaths are so horrific, maybe you want to put more effort into preventing them than preventing deaths from, like, say, walking or these other things. I don't know where that balance is, but I at least feel a little more educated that it's not nearly as likely as a lot of other things. Okay, so that's the education piece. Now I want to turn to the scripture. And where I want to start is back in the Old Testament, then we'll come to the New. And what I want to note for you is that our religious history, similar to our national history, is intricately tied up with immigration. Back in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1, it says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you.' Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot and all the possessions that they had gathered and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. When they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land." Okay, Abram becomes Abraham. He's the father of the Hebrew people. This is the beginning of the story in the Bible where God chooses a people to set aside and with a particular mission. A little later in chapter 12, God comes and says, "I'm going to bless you and your descendants so that you will be a blessing to others." So this is the very beginning of a chosen group of followers of God. And God could have done that right where Abram was living in Haran, or before Abram moved there, he was living in the area of Persia or modern day Iran and Iraq. God could have done it there. For whatever reason, God chose to set these people apart, to give them this mission, chose to make them immigrants. They come into Canaan, and then there's a famine later on, and Abram's descendants have to immigrate again, this time to Egypt. And while they're in Egypt, the people are afraid of them, and they eventually make them slaves. God, through Moses, leads them out of Egypt and out of slavery back into the land of Canaan, modern-day Israel. And as they're getting ready to go in there, this is going to be the point in history where they start to form an actual political nation. God gives them laws to guide their character as a nation, presumably to shape the kind of people they're going to be as they're being this blessing to the rest of the world. And I want to read you part of the legal code of ancient Israel from the book of Leviticus, chapter 19. It says, "When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself. For you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." And so codified into the law is this recognition that God's people have this history of immigration and that they're going to live with aliens, foreigners, and God's direction that's shaping the character of the nation through their laws is to treat them like their family, basically. Now, if you know enough of Old Testament history, you'll know that not all foreigners are treated with this kind of love, even by God. You have ones that are described in very negative terms. What I found looking in the Old Testament, though, is God's position in the law and in what God says starts out as neutral, or even saying welcome them in and love them. And then if they break the laws, if they break religious laws, if they start worshiping other gods, if they do something to hurt God's people, then they get thrown into this category where they're referred to negatively. But the starting place and the aspiration for the character of the nation is to treat them as family. Okay, so let me take you to the New Testament. And we find in Matthew chapter 2 these words. It says, "Now after the wise men had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, 'Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him.' Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night and went to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I have called my son.'" So this is a story from when Jesus is a couple years old. His early childhood begins as a political refugee. They go to Egypt. They wait out till King Herod's no longer looking to kill Jesus. Then they move back to Israel. And then later in Jesus' life, when he's teaching people about being followers of God, he tells a story one day about what it'll be like on Judgment Day when God sees our lives and judges us, and we either get to go to heaven or go to hell, and what are the criteria that God uses to make that judgment. And in Matthew chapter 25, verse 34, this is what Jesus says. He says, "Then the king will say to those at his right hand, 'Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. As Jesus is telling this story, he says that there are people who will be hearing this, the judgment that's pronounced, and they'll say, well, God, when did we ever welcome you when you were a stranger, or feed you, or clothe you, or do these other things? And God says, whenever you did it for one of the least of me, it's as if you did it for me. Jesus is telling them that whenever you welcome a stranger or do any of these other things, that God credits it to us as if we did that for Jesus. So in both the Old Testament and the New, we get this sense that somehow the immigrant experience somehow shapes the people of God, and that that's a desirable thing by God because it happened to the people in the Old Testament, it happened to Jesus, and also that God has a heart for people who are strangers in a different land and calls God's people to do that. Now, what does that mean for our policies and politics? I don't know, because as I shared from that report, it's complicated. Some of the things said on the left, there's truth to that. Some of the things said on the right, there's truth to that. And how you balance that and figure out that, I don't know. Personally, I hope that as we set laws, because that kinds to be a time-consuming process, especially to change them, I hope that our laws are less reactionary and more aspirational, that our laws would speak to who we want to be as a people rather than maybe to our fears. But that's just as a person, as an individual. Adam Hamilton, he's a pastor of the largest Methodist church in the U.S. up in Kansas. He made a statement in talking about immigration. He says that the general purpose of our laws are to express our heart as a people and where we are and to put that into our laws, kind of like they did in the Old Testament, where they were codifying who they wanted to be as a people. And I think about my heart. And I know that my heart carries a lot of fear. And so whatever happens politically and with policies, I pray that God will give me a heart that is courageous, that is compassionate, and that is bold. I think if I can have a heart like that, and if we can create a community like that, and maybe, God willing, a nation like that, I think the laws will have a way of working themselves out. Amen.